Timeline 1. So in Timeline 1, John Connor was born in 1985. Somehow in this timeline he may have a military background. John's father in this timeline dies long before Judgment Day takes place. The Skynet program is made for the military. It then goes online in 2004 and Judgment Day occurs. This is also the year Kyle Reese is born and eventually joins John in the resistance against Skynet when he grows up. So the war is ongoing for years until John and the last of the resistance finally beat Skynet in 2029. As a last minute hope to regain the upper hand, Skynet sends back a T-800 model in their time displacement machine and send him back to 1984 to kill John's mother before John is born. This jumps us to Timeline 2. So Timeline 2 is the same as Timeline 1 from the beginning of time, but with altercations from 1984 onwards. So in 1984, the events of Terminator 1 take place exactly how it went down in the film, minus some exceptions. The paradoxes. In the film, John gives Kyle a photo of his mother in the future. Then after the events of the film, Sarah has that picture taken of her, who will then give to John, who will give to Kyle in the future once again, and repeat. This does not happen in Timeline 2, but it does originate from it. It is where it's first born, just not a paradox just yet. So after the events of T1, the T-800's arm and chip were left behind in Cyberdyne Systems, who then began doing work based off these icons. Due to this, Skynet is created earlier than it was in the original timeline and comes online earlier, and Judgment Day now occurs in 1997. This would cause a huge ripple effect. So although in the original timeline Kyle Reese was conceived in 2003, the circumstances around this year would have now changed drastically. So more than likely Kyle Reese does not exist in this timeline due to an early Judgment Day preventing his birth. Due to her mission into trying to prevent Judgment Day, Sarah ends up in an asylum and John gets put into foster care. Although this John wasn't the John of the original timeline, he was born and bred into believing he has to become a leader and saviour of humanity. So he does. And when Judgment Day comes around, he believes everything his mother said to him and builds himself up to become the destined hero he was prophesied to be. And in this timeline, he defeats Skynet in not 2029, but 2030. Once again, as a last minute attempt, Skynet sends back a Terminator to 1995 to kill John as a child. Due to Skynet advancing quicker in this timeline, it is a T-1000 that is sent back, not a T-800. But alas, John also ups his game in this timeline too and sends back a reprogrammed T-800 to protect himself. This jumps us into Timeline 3. Timeline 3 is the same as Timeline 2 from the beginning of time, but now everything from 1995 onwards is altered. The events of Terminator 2 take place in our characters attempt to prevent Judgment Day by destroying Cyberdyne. But what actually happens, instead of it occurring in 1997, it reverts back to 2004 as Skynet becomes aware once again during the military project that also took place in Timeline 1. But before we get to 2004, we sadly lose Sarah in 1997 regardless, as she dies of leukemia. John then lives off the grid but has an unlikely reunion with Captain Brewster on the day of Judgment Day as he attempts to steal painkillers at Brewster's occupation. This would end up a lively partnership between John, Catherine and her father, Lieutenant General Robert Brewster. So the war takes place, and by the year 2032, victory comes near for our resistance team. Due to John having sentiments for the T-800 model because of the events of Terminator 2, Skynet sends a T-850 model to infiltrate the resistance base and kill John by surprise, as the model resembles the T-800 but is far more superior. This plan works, but it does not stop the resistance from reaching victory due to John's wife Catherine and the other lieutenants finishing what John started. So Skynet sends their most superior model in this timeline back to the year of Judgment Day to kill John, Catherine, Robert Brewster and the future lieutenants. This jumps us to Timeline 4. The events of Terminator 3 take place in 2004, then Kyle Reese is born. The next notable events that take place are Terminator Salvation in 2018, which there is a few things I would like to address about this. A lot of people say that this film has a lot of plot holes, such as Skynet should have not known that Kyle Reese was John's father. But of course it would. He's one of the main reasons for this timeline existing. Another one was Kyle Reese was number 1 on their kill list, but instead they just capture him and take him prisoner. People thought that if they just killed Kyle Reese there and then, John wouldn't exist anymore. That isn't true, and Skynet knows that. Why would they even need a kill list?
It's a trap!
John is under the impression that he can only exist based on the actual predestination of Kyle having to be sent back. In the other timelines, he figures it's not exactly the case when the year 2029 comes and he no longer needs to do what he was warned to do. But before that year, he thinks his life is dependent on that moment. What proof do we have that John's existence is based on predestination? Sarah Connor. The word of a deadbeat waitress in the 80s. She's put 2 and 2 together and got 5. Not that we can blame her. How was she supposed to know the logistics of time travel? And in fairness, a heavy burden was thrown at her while also being given very vague information as to what was happening. and not to mention being terrorised by a cyborg killer. She does her best to make sense of all this, so she comes up with the predestination idea. It's not as if she could get advice off anyone.
We are to believe that after the events of Terminator Salvation, everything is uncertain to us what's going to happen next. I know exactly what they did. The one thing that ties all these movies together, using what his mother taught him against him. Skynet has been beaten by John in every timeline around the same time period, no matter what they do, so they have to up their game. Skynet knows that John's mother bred into him that Kyle Reese is his father, and the T-800 is sent back to 1984, and he must send Kyle back also. This is actually a major benefit for Skynet, which will help them up their game. So in this timeline, Kyle Reese exists again as he did in the original timeline, as Judgment Day is once again in 2004, his conceivement will once again be in 2003. So although John Connor will be different to the original John Connor from Timeline 1, which we never saw or heard about, Kyle will be the same age as his counterpart, have the same training, and this time round, John will be grooming him to fall in love with his mother.
John Connor gave me a picture of you once. I didn't know why at the time.
So if Skynet take this action of sending a T-800 from 2029 to 1984, like they did in the original timeline, everything that I've discussed here will happen again, over and over, jumping from timeline to timeline. Skynet and our heroes doing the same actions over and over forever. So here we go. In 2029, Skynet repeats their Timeline 1 incident, sending back a T-800, and allow John to send Kyle. This jumps us into Timeline 5. Timeline 5 is the same as Timeline 4, but repeats forever from 1984 to 2033. So because this period repeats over and over, it becomes a tangent universe created by Skynet. In this universe, time is like a circle. It has a loop that has no beginning or end. So as the creator of the tangent universe, and seen time with no beginning nor end, just like God in the Bible, Skynet is now the god of this universe and has become more powerful and will now be able to up its game with a new strategy, which it does in Genesis. That will be another discussion. But here in Timeline 5, although everything will play out the same, there will be a few minor altercations which will be seen only in Terminator 1. The paradoxes. When Kyle initially tells Sarah that John's father died before the war, he will actually be talking about himself and not realise. In Timeline 5, John will be grooming Kyle to fall in love with his mother, therefore will give him the photo she got of herself at the end of the Terminator 1 events in Timeline 2. This photo will now be passed on from character to character in a paradox way. This also means that the future we see in Terminator 1 is also Timeline 5, therefore the John he is now talking about to Sarah is the John we see in the film series. So due to the many manipulations of time, the predestination is now apparent in this tangent universe. So the film series Terminator 1 to 4 is in fact a tangent universe set in the 5th timeline with no beginning or end in time from 1984 to 2033.